My husband told me for 20 years that we were poor and barely making ends meet. But after his death, I found an old suitcase in his garage. Inside, $17 million in cash, and a note, "Forgive me for hiding this. What happened next changed everything." Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say you never truly know the person sleeping next to you. I used to think that was just something people said. One of those dramatic phrases you hear in movies, the kind that make you roll your eyes and reach for another handful of popcorn. I was wrong. Lord, was I wrong. My name is Carol Henderson. I lived in a pale yellow ranch house on Elmwood Drive in Dayton, Ohio. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a cracked driveway that Frank kept saying he'd have repaved next spring. For 22 years, next spring never came. Neither did a lot of things. Frank Henderson was 61 years old when he died. Massive heart attack, right there in the living room, on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was watching the news. I was in the kitchen making chicken soup. I heard a thud, and when I came around the corner, he was already on the floor, his glasses knocked sideways on his face. By the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing left to save. Just like that. 26 years of marriage, and it ended on a Tuesday, on our worn-out carpet while the soup went cold on the stove. I won't pretend our marriage was perfect. No marriage is. But I did believe we had something honest, something real. Frank was a quiet man, methodical, careful with words, careful with money, especially careful with money. That was the thing about Frank. The thing. He managed every dollar in our household with a kind of grim precision that I always interpreted as responsibility. We never went on vacations. Too expensive. We drove old cars. Why buy new when used works fine? The kids, our daughter Melissa and our son Trevor, went to state schools on financial aid because Frank said private tuition would break us. I shopped the sales. I clipped coupons. I worked part-time at the library for 12 years to help with the bills, even though I never once saw a bank statement that told me exactly how close to the edge we really were. Frank handled all of that. He always said it was easier if one person managed the finances. He said it was his way of taking care of me. I believed him. That is the part that still keeps me awake at night. Not the anger, not the grief, but the simple, devastating fact that I believed him completely. The weeks after his funeral were the worst kind of fog. Melissa flew in from Portland and stayed for 10 days. Trevor drove up from Columbus on weekends. Friends brought casseroles. My neighbor Dorothy held my hand on the porch and told me Frank had been a good man. I nodded. I poured the casseroles into containers and put them in the freezer and tried to remember how to breathe. It was a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after the funeral, when I finally worked up the courage to go into the garage. Not because I wanted to, because Melissa had offered to help me sort through Frank's things before she flew home, and I couldn't keep asking her to wait. Frank's garage was his kingdom. I almost never went in there. He kept it locked. For the tools, he said, though he was never much of a handyman. After he died, I found the key on his key ring, the small brass one I'd never paid attention to before. The lock was stiff. I had to work it twice before the door swung open. It smelled like oil and old wood and something dry, like paper left in the sun too long. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the shelves of organized toolboxes, the dusty workbench, the old riding lawnmower we'd had since 2009. Everything in its place, everything labeled. That was Frank. The suitcase was in the back, behind the lawnmower, half covered with a blue tarp. A large, old-fashioned, hard-sided suitcase, dark brown, the kind they made in the 70s, that I had never seen before in my life. Something about it stopped me. Some instinct. I stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. The way you pause at the top of a staircase in the dark, knowing you have to go down but not quite ready to take the first step. I pulled off the tarp. The latches were not locked. I opened it. I don't have adequate words for what I saw. Money. Banded stacks of $100 bills, packed tight, filling every inch of that suitcase. I stepped back. My hand went to my mouth. I looked at the money and then looked at the garage door behind me and then looked at the money again, as if the scene would rearrange itself into something that made sense. There was an envelope taped to the inside of the lid, white, letter-sized, sealed. My name was written on the front in Frank's handwriting, Carol's in blue ink, in the careful, even script I had read on birthday cards and grocery lists for a quarter century. I sat down on the concrete floor. I opened the envelope. Carol, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. For every lie. For every year you went without. For every time I watched you clip those coupons and said nothing. The money is real. It's yours. All of it. There is approximately $17 million in this suitcase. Please be careful who you trust. Forgive me if you can. I loved you every day, even when I was wrong. Frank. I read it twice. Then I sat on that cold concrete floor in my dead husband's garage, surrounded by $17 million I never knew existed, and I cried until I couldn't breathe. I stayed in that garage for a long time, long enough for the November light to shift and go gray through the small window above the workbench, long enough to stop crying and start thinking, which was harder. The first coherent thought I had was this: I cannot call anyone. Not Melissa, not Trevor, not Dorothy from next door, not Pastor Reed, no one. Some primitive gut-level instinct told me that the moment I picked up a phone and said the words out loud, "There is $17 million in your father's garage," the situation would leave my hands entirely. And whatever this was, whatever Frank had done, whatever trap he had left me standing in the middle of, I needed to understand it before I shared it with a living soul. So I did not call anyone. Instead, I got up off the floor, brushed the dust from my slacks, and I counted the money. It took 4 hours. I found a yellow legal pad on Frank's workbench. He always kept legal pads, another one of his precise habits, and I stacked the bills by denomination and I wrote down the numbers. The bundles were banded in $10,000 increments. There were 170 of them. The note was accurate. $17 million, give or take a handful of loose hundreds, tucked into the corners of the suitcase like someone had been adding to it over time. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. I re-locked the suitcase. I recovered it with the tarp. I locked the garage door behind me, came inside, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and stood there gripping the edge of the counter, staring out the window at our backyard, the yard I had mowed and weeded and planted tomatoes in for over 2 decades. And I tried to figure out what my life actually was, because here was the thing. Here was the math that didn't add up, the equation that was making my chest tight. Frank had $17 million in cash hidden in our garage, and for 22 years he had told me we were broke. He had watched me work part-time at a library for $12 an hour and told me it was necessary. He had told our children, that there was no money for the schools they'd dreamed of. Melissa had wanted to go to NYU for graphic design. She cried for a week when Frank sat her down and explained they couldn't afford it. She went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship instead, and she never once complained about it because she trusted her father. I stood at the sink for a long time, and the grief I felt in those minutes was different from the grief of losing him. It was colder. It was something that lived right next to grief, but was not grief at all. The fear came later, after dark, when I was lying in our bed. In my bed now, staring at the ceiling, because I began to ask myself the obvious question: where does $17 million in cash come from? Frank had worked as a regional manager for an auto parts distributor for 30 years. His salary, as far as I knew, had never exceeded $90,000 a year. We had a modest 401k. We had the house, which still had 11 years left on the mortgage. There was no inheritance, no windfall, no lottery ticket. There was no version of legitimate life that produced $17 million in physical cash, stored in a suitcase, hidden under a tarp in a locked garage. Frank had been doing something I didn't know about, something that generated serious money, and something that, for reasons stated only as be careful who you trust, he felt could not be kept in a bank. That thought was the one that made me get out of bed at 2 a.m. and sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, because somewhere in the back of my mind, a very quiet, very calm voice was saying, "Carol, this money may not be safe for you to have." But a louder voice, a voice I didn't fully recognize, one that had apparently been waiting inside me for quite some time, said something else entirely. It said, 22 years, Carol. 22 years of coupons and secondhand furniture and telling yourself it was fine, it was responsible, it was love. 22 years of someone else holding all the cards. Not anymore. That was the moment I made my decision, not recklessly, not in anger, but clearly and deliberately, the way you make a decision when you finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell you what to do. I was not going to panic. I was not going to make any sudden moves. I was going to find out exactly what this money was, where it came from, and what my legal position was, and then I was going to protect myself. I went to the desk in the small office off the hallway, Frank's desk, and I began going through the filing cabinet he'd kept locked for as long as I could remember. The key was on his key ring, too, right next to the garage key. I don't know why I hadn't thought to look there before. Maybe I hadn't wanted to know. I opened the drawer and I pulled out the first folder, and I began to read. By 4 a.m, I had a name. Dennis. Frank's younger brother, Dennis Henderson, appeared on documents I had never seen: LLC formation papers, vehicle title transfers, unsigned partnership agreements going back 15 years. Dennis, whom I'd always known as Frank's difficult brother, the one Frank kept at arm's length, the one who had never once come to a holiday dinner without tension following him through the door like a cold draft. Dennis, who had called me 4 days after the funeral, not to offer condolences, but to ask, very casually, very carefully, whether I had gotten around to sorting through Frank's things yet. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I thought a great deal of it now. I closed the filing cabinet. I sat in Frank's chair in Frank's office and I looked at the framed photo on his desk. The 4 of us at Melissa's college graduation, all of us smiling. And I thought, okay, Frank, you left me a puzzle. Let's see if I can solve it. The first piece was finding someone I could trust absolutely. Someone who couldn't be pressured, couldn't be charmed, and couldn't be bought. I needed a lawyer. I did not open a phone book or type divorce lawyer into a search engine. I thought about that carefully. I needed someone with no connection to Frank, no connection to Dayton's old money circles, and absolutely no prior relationship with the Henderson family. That narrowed the field considerably. I drove 45 minutes to Columbus on a Wednesday morning, telling no one where I was going. I told Melissa, who called every day that week, that I was running errands. I told my neighbor Dorothy, who had a habit of watching the driveway, that I had a doctor's appointment. Then I sat in the parking lot of a coffee shop on North High Street, and I used my phone to look up estate and asset protection attorneys in the Columbus metro area. I read reviews. I read bar association listings. I looked for someone with a clean record, a practice that handled complex estates, and, critically, a reputation for discretion. I found Martin Sorley. His office was on the 14th floor of a downtown building that smelled like floor wax and old ambition. He was in his late 50s, trim, with the kind of unhurried calm that told you he had heard complicated stories before and was not easily rattled by them. His assistant brought me coffee without being asked. I took that as a good sign. I sat across from him and I told him everything. The suitcase, the note, the amount, the folders in Frank's filing cabinet, Dennis's phone call. All of it, in the same flat, sequential way I'd been rehearsing in my head since 4 a.m. 3 days before. When I finished, Martin Sorley was quiet for a moment. Then he uncapped his pen and said, "Mrs. Henderson, before we discuss strategy, I need you to answer one question honestly. Do you believe your husband's business activities may have been illegal?" I looked at him. "I believe it's possible," I said. "I don't know. That's part of why I'm here." He nodded. "Good answer," he said, "and the right one." What followed over the next 2 hours was the most important conversation of my life up to that point. Martin explained my situation with surgical precision. The cash itself was not automatically illegal to possess. Until or unless a court determined it was proceeds from criminal activity, it was part of Frank's estate, and therefore, depending on the structure of our marriage and Ohio law, potentially mine. But the manner in which it had been accumulated mattered enormously. If it was connected to tax evasion, money laundering, or fraud, I could face civil forfeiture proceedings. The IRS would eventually have questions regardless, and Dennis Henderson, if he had been a business partner, might have legal standing to claim a portion, or might attempt to claim it through intimidation, whether he had standing or not. "The most important thing you can do right now," Martin said, "is document everything before you move a dollar. And the second most important thing is that you don't discuss this with anyone else until we understand what we're dealing with." I agreed to both conditions without hesitation. Over the following week, Martin engaged a forensic accountant named Diane Pruitt, a small, precise woman who reminded me of my 7th grade math teacher and who, I quickly learned, had previously worked for the IRS. Diane's job was to trace the origins of the money, to build a financial timeline of Frank's activities and determine, as clearly as the paper trail would allow, where $17 million had come from. Meanwhile, I went home, and I waited. And I watched. It was during that week that I first noticed the car, a gray Honda Accord parked on the street half a block down from our house, in a spot where no one from the neighborhood ever parked. It was there Tuesday morning. It was there again. Thursday afternoon. On Friday, I walked to the end of the driveway to get the mail, and I looked directly at it, and it pulled away before I could see the driver clearly. Dennis. I called Martin that evening. He told me to start keeping a log, dates, times, descriptions. He also told me something that settled into my stomach like a stone. If Dennis knows about the money, Mrs. Henderson, he's going to move fast. People like that always do. "What kind of person is he?" I asked. Martin paused. The kind who spent 15 years in business with your husband off the books. Make of that what you will. The first direct evidence came on a Friday at the end of November. Diane called me from Columbus and asked me to come to her office. When I arrived, she had a single-page summary on her desk, printed in clean columns with highlighted figures and dates. She walked me through it methodically, the way you explain something to someone who needs to understand it completely and has no room for confusion. Frank and Dennis had operated 3 used car dealerships, 2 in Dayton, 1 in Springfield, through a web of LLCs that had been structured to obscure individual ownership. For at least 15 years, they had been systematically skimming cash from the dealership's sales revenue before it hit the books. The cash was never deposited. It was never reported. It was physically extracted from the business, salted away in a long, patient accumulation that produced, over 15 years, somewhere in the range of $22 to $25 million total. Frank's share, based on the partnership split implied by the documents, was approximately 45%. 45% of $25 million was $11.25 million. I looked at Diane. The suitcase had $17 million, I said. She looked back at me without blinking. Yes, she said. It did. The implication was clear, and it was cold. Frank had been skimming from his own skimming operation. He had been taking more than his share, hiding it not just from the government, but from Dennis. And Dennis, I realized, almost certainly knew it. That was why he had called. That was why the gray Honda sat on my street. That was not a grieving brother-in-law checking on his late brother's widow. That was a man who believed there was money owed to him and who was trying to figure out how much I knew. I drove home from Columbus that evening with my hands very steady on the wheel and my mind running through the next steps with a clarity I had not felt in years. 22 years of keeping the peace, 22 years of deferring, 22 years of being managed. I was done being managed. Martin moved quickly once we had Diane's report in hand. The plan we had built together over 3 weeks was methodical and airtight, exactly the kind of plan I needed because there was nothing improvised about what Dennis Henderson was capable of, and I knew it. The first step was the estate filing. Martin petitioned the probate court in Montgomery County to open Frank's estate, listing all known assets including the cash, which was now formally documented and photographed, serial numbers recorded, total confirmed, and stored in a secured location that Martin had arranged through a licensed bonding company. It was no longer sitting under a tarp in my garage. It was no longer mine to lose through carelessness or fear. The second step was the IRS voluntary disclosure. Martin had explained this to me carefully during our first meeting. If I came forward proactively, disclosed the cash and its origins before the IRS came looking, and cooperated fully, I had significantly better legal standing than if I waited and was found. It would cost money. There would be penalties and back taxes owed, likely a substantial portion of whatever I ultimately received. But I would not go to prison. I would not face forfeiture proceedings as a criminal's widow. I would emerge on the other side as a cooperating witness, not a suspect. I signed the disclosure paperwork on a Tuesday morning in mid-December. Dennis found out by Thursday. I have no way of knowing exactly how he found out. Martin believed Dennis had a contact somewhere in the county clerk's office who had flagged the probate filing. What I know is that Dennis called my cell phone at 7:15 in the evening, and when I answered, he did not bother with pleasantries. "Carol?" His voice was flat and tight, like a wire pulled too taut. "I know what you filed. I need you to understand something. That money doesn't belong to you. Half of everything Frank had was mine. He knew it. You need to talk to your attorney and pull back whatever you've started before this becomes something you can't walk away from. I was standing in my kitchen. The dinner I had made sat cooling on the stove. I looked at the window above the sink, the one that faced the backyard, and I thought about all the evenings I'd stood at that window and told myself everything was fine. "Dennis," I said, "you should speak to my attorney directly. His name is Martin Sorley. I'll text you his number." A long silence. "Carol?" His voice dropped. "You don't want to make an enemy of me. Frank knew better. You should too." "Good night, Dennis," I said, and I ended the call. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and I allowed my hands to shake for exactly 5 minutes, because I had learned by then that the shaking wasn't weakness. It was adrenaline, and it passed, and it was followed by something cooler and steadier. The escalation came 2 days later. Dennis appeared at my front door on a Saturday morning. I saw his truck in the driveway from the bedroom window before I came down. I called Martin first. Martin told me not to open the door and to record anything said on my phone. I did both. Dennis knocked 3 times, then pressed the doorbell. "Carol, I know you're in there. Open the door. We need to talk like adults." I stood in the hallway, phone recording, and said through the door, "Dennis, I've been advised by my attorney not to discuss estate matters outside of a formal legal context. If you have something to say, please contact Martin Sorley." What followed was not a conversation. It was 7 minutes of Dennis standing on my porch in the December cold, telling me in increasingly direct terms that Frank had stolen from him, that I was benefiting from stolen property, that he had documentation proving the partnership existed, and that he would burn everything down rather than let me walk away with money that wasn't mine. He said the word lawyer the way people say a threat, not a solution. He said he had friends who could make my life very complicated. He said I was a naive woman who had no idea what I'd stepped into. I didn't say another word. I let him talk. I let the phone record every syllable. When he finally stopped, I heard his footsteps leave the porch. His truck started. He drove away. I sent the recording to Martin within the hour. Martin was very pleased. "Threatening a witness in an estate proceeding is a federal matter, Mrs. Henderson," he told me. "He just made your case considerably stronger." But knowing that didn't make the following days easy. The truth is, after Dennis left my porch, something in me, the part that had been carrying the tension of the last 2 months like a stone pressed against my sternum, simply gave out, not in defeat, more like a gear that had been running too fast for too long and needed to stop before it stripped itself clean. Melissa called that evening and I told her I was tired. "Mom, you sound wrong," she said, which was exactly the kind of perception I'd always loved about her. "I'm okay," I told her. "I just need a few days." I took them. 3 days, I gave myself. I unplugged the laptop. I didn't check my email. I drove out to the state park near Yellow Springs on Sunday afternoon, and I walked along the frozen creek path for 2 hours in complete silence, just the cold air and the bare trees and the sound of ice cracking softly underfoot. I ate soup. I slept 8 hours, which I hadn't done since before Frank died. Sometimes, in the middle of a fight, the most powerful thing you can do is stop running long enough to remember why you started. On Wednesday, I called Martin. "What's next?" I said. He sounded almost cheerful. "Now," he said, "we wait for Dennis to make another mistake." Dennis's next move surprised me because it was not a threat. It was an offer. Martin called me the second week of January to tell me that Dennis had retained an attorney, a man named Gary Pullman, who had an office in downtown Dayton and a reputation for aggressive civil litigation, and that Pullman had reached out to open informal discussions. The proposed framework, as Martin relayed it, was straightforward in its audacity. Dennis would drop all claims against the estate and sign a formal release if I transferred $4 million to an account of his choosing. In cash, quietly, no paper trail, no IRS involvement on his end. In other words, he wanted me to launder money for him. "He's testing you," Martin said. "He wants to know if you're scared enough to do something that would compromise your own legal position." "What would happen if I agreed?" I asked. "You would be committing a federal crime," Martin said, "and Dennis would own you, because then he'd have evidence of your misconduct, and you'd never be free of him." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "Tell Mr. Pullman we decline." Martin did, and then we waited. The waiting was the strange part. For 2 weeks after that, nothing happened. No gray Honda on the street, no phone calls, no appearances on my porch. Dennis went quiet in the way that predators go quiet, not because they've given up, but because they're watching, reassessing, looking for a new angle. I could feel it, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. I made a decision during those 2 weeks. I had been carrying this alone for too long. Not all of it. Martin knew everything. Diane knew the finances. But the emotional weight of it, the daily reality of living inside a secret this large, was beginning to erode something in me. I could feel myself becoming guarded in ways that weren't healthy. I had started checking the street every time I pulled out of the driveway. I'd stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I was turning inward in a way that felt less like caution and more like isolation. I needed a person. Not a professional, a person. I thought about who in my life I actually trusted, and the list was shorter than I would have liked. But at the top of it, clearly and without question, was Patty Morrison. Patty and I had been friends since our daughters were in the same kindergarten class, which made it 24 years. She was the kind of person who had once driven 90 minutes in a snowstorm to sit with me in an ER waiting room when Melissa broke her wrist at a school trip, asking no questions and expecting nothing. She was also, importantly, a retired paralegal who had spent 20 years in family law, which meant she understood discretion not as a preference, but as a professional discipline. I called her on a Thursday evening in mid-January and asked if she could come over. She arrived 30 minutes later with a bottle of decent red wine and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this phone call for a while. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat in the dark in November and tried to figure out what my life was. And I told her everything, all of it. When I finished, Patty was quiet for a moment. Then she poured us each another glass of wine and said, "Carol, how long have you been carrying this by yourself?" "Since October," I said. She shook her head slowly, not in disbelief. She believed every word, but with the kind of sorrow that comes from knowing someone well enough to understand exactly what it cost them to keep something hidden for that long. "You should have called me in November," she said. "I know," I said. "I wasn't ready." "Are you ready now?" "Yes." What Patty gave me over the next hour was not legal advice, not a strategy. Martin had all of that covered. But something I hadn't realized I was missing. The experience of being seen, of having another person look at the full weight of what I was carrying and say, without flinching, "I see it, and I'm not going anywhere." She also gave me something practical. She had a friend, a woman she'd worked with in the 90s who now ran a small nonprofit supporting women navigating financial abuse and estate fraud. "These situations are more common than people think," Patty said. "Women who spent decades being kept in the dark about money. There's a support structure for this. You don't have to build everything from scratch. I hadn't thought of what Frank had done as financial abuse. The phrase sat strangely, but it fit. 22 years of deliberate concealment. 22 years of manufactured scarcity. Yes, that was what it was. "I'll think about it," I told her. "You'll do more than think about it," she said, which was very Patty. I walked her to the door at 10 o'clock and watched her drive away, and then I stood on the porch in the January cold for a few minutes. The street was quiet. No gray Honda, no trucks in the driveway, just the bare elms and the orange glow of the street lights and the silence of a neighborhood settling in for the night. Dennis was watching. I was certain of it. But for the first time since October, I felt something I can only describe as equilibrium. The situation had not changed. The danger had not passed. But I was no longer alone in it, and that changed everything about what I was capable of. I went inside. I locked the door. I called Martin's office line and left a message asking him to let me know the moment Dennis made another move. I didn't have to wait long. They came on a Saturday morning in February, which was calculated, a weekend when I wouldn't have Martin immediately available, when the formality of weekday business hours would be stripped away, and it would feel like family, like a conversation between people who had known each other for years. That was the point. Dennis always did understand the value of setting. He called the evening before. His voice was different, warmer, smoothed down, like he'd spent time practicing it. Carol, Gail, and I were hoping we could stop by tomorrow, just to talk. No lawyers, no paperwork. We've been going about this all wrong, and I think we both know it. Family should be able to sit down together. A pause. Frank would have wanted that. That last sentence was the tell. Frank would have wanted that. An appeal to a dead man's wishes, aimed at a widow. I recognized it for exactly what it was. I said yes. I wanted to see what they would do when they had a room to perform in. Gail Henderson was Dennis's wife of 18 years, a thin, carefully put-together woman who wore her pleasantness the way some people wear expensive coats, as a statement rather than a comfort. She came through my front door with a small arrangement of grocery store flowers and an expression of warm concern that she maintained with remarkable consistency throughout the first 20 minutes of our conversation. They sat at my kitchen table, the table where I had sat in the dark in November, the table where Patty and I had shared wine in January. And Dennis put his hands flat on the surface and looked at me with the practiced openness of a man who had decided to try sincerity as a tactic. "Carol," he said, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I know I said things on the phone that came out harder than I meant them. I was grieving. I was angry. I want you to know that none of it was personal." "I understand," I said. I had put the kettle on. I poured coffee. I kept my hands occupied and my face neutral. Gail leaned forward. "Carol, we've been so worried about you. You're going through this alone, and this whole legal process. It must be so overwhelming. Dennis just wants to make sure you're protected." "That's very kind," I said. Dennis cleared his throat. "Here's the thing, Carol. The honest thing. Frank and I built those businesses together. I know there were some irregularities financially. I'm not here to get anyone in trouble. I'm not here to drag Frank's name through anything. I just want what was ours, what we built. And I think if you talk to your attorney, really talk to him without all the defensive posturing, he'll tell you that the fairest thing, the thing that keeps everyone out of court and keeps everything quiet, is to settle this between us." Gail nodded along with every word, a chorus of two. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Dennis shifted forward. 5 million, not 4, like Gary suggested before. I know that offended you, and I'm sorry. 5 million clean transferred privately. You keep the rest. You keep the house. You keep everything Frank left you. We go our separate ways. No more lawyers. No more filings. No more... He let this next word land carefully. Complications. I looked at him. I looked at Gail. The flowers she'd brought were sitting on my counter in their plastic wrap, stems still in the cellophane. Dennis, I said, what you're describing is asking me to make an off-the-books cash transfer to avoid federal disclosure requirements. I've already disclosed to the IRS and to the probate court. There's no version of what you're describing that isn't a federal crime. The warmth dropped from Dennis's face. Not all at once. That was the interesting thing. It happened in stages, like a sun going behind clouds. First the smile faded, then the openness around his eyes, then the posture. The hands that had been flat and open on the table curled slightly inward. Carol. His voice was lower now. You're making a mistake. I don't think I am, I said. Gail made one last attempt. Carol, we're family. You don't want to turn this into something ugly. Think about Melissa and Trevor. Think about what it will do to them to have their father's name in court documents and newspapers. My children are adults, I said, and they know who their father was, both the good and the difficult. That was the moment the mask came completely off. Dennis stood up, not suddenly. He was too controlled for that, but with a slow deliberateness that was in some ways worse than a sudden movement. You're going to regret this, he said. I've been very patient with you, Carol. I've been trying to handle this the right way, but you clearly need to learn what happens when you put yourself between a man and what belongs to him. I think it's time for you to leave, I said. Gail grabbed her purse. Her face had gone rigid, the performance entirely abandoned. She's not worth it, she said to Dennis, which told me everything I needed to know about what those two had said about me in private. I walked them to the door. I held it open. I did not say anything else. I watched them get into Dennis's truck, a newer model than the one I'd seen that first fall, I noticed, and I watched them drive away without looking back. Then I closed the door and I locked it, and I stood with my back against it in the entryway of my house, and yes, I was afraid. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Dennis Henderson was a man who had spent 15 years building an illegal enterprise, who had watched his brother skim from him for years and said nothing, because saying nothing was more valuable than saying something. And now he was angry and he felt entitled, and he had just told me, directly, that there would be consequences. That fear was real. I felt it in my chest, cold and specific. But here's what I learned that February morning, standing against my own front door. Fear and paralysis are not the same thing. Fear, if you hold it right, tells you exactly how much is at stake. And knowing what's at stake tells you exactly how hard to fight. I pushed off the door. I went to the kitchen table. I sat down and I wrote out, in my own handwriting on a legal pad, every single thing Dennis and Gail had said that morning. Every word I could recall. The time they arrived, the time they left, the specific phrases, the implied threat. Then I photographed the pages and emailed them to Martin. His reply came 12 minutes later. Perfect. This is exactly what we needed. The formal mediation was scheduled for the first Tuesday in March in a conference room on the 7th floor of a building in downtown Columbus. Martin had suggested Columbus deliberately, neutral ground, away from the social geography of Dayton, where Dennis had spent decades cultivating useful relationships. The room was glass-walled, long-tabled, and had the particular silence of a place where serious things were decided. Martin had prepared for 6 weeks. Diane's forensic report was complete. The IRS voluntary disclosure was processed, the estimated tax liability calculated, a payment plan accepted. There was a clear paper trail now, not of criminality on my part, but of cooperation. Of a widow who, upon discovering the truth about her husband's financial activities, had immediately sought legal counsel and notified the appropriate authorities. The contrast to Dennis's position, which was characterized by 15 years of active participation in tax fraud, was stark. Martin had also engaged a second attorney, a former federal prosecutor named Elaine Okafor, who specialized in financial crime. Elaine was 47 years old, and she had the particular energy of someone who had spent years in courtrooms deciding which battles were worth fighting and which were not. She had reviewed everything. She had reviewed the recording from Dennis's visit to my porch. She had reviewed the transcript of the February conversation, which I had recalled in writing within 30 minutes of Dennis and Gail leaving. She had reviewed the phone call where Dennis had asked me to pull back what I'd filed. He has a pattern, Elaine told me the day before the mediation. Intimidation, then incentivizing, then appeal to sentiment, then threat. He's done this before. Possibly not in legal proceedings, but in business. It's a negotiating style that works when the other party isn't prepared for it. I've been prepared for 3 months, I said. She looked at me with an expression that was as close to approval as I suspected Elaine Okafor got. Yes, she said, you have. Dennis and Gail arrived with Gary Pullman at 10 o'clock. Dennis was wearing a suit, charcoal gray, which I had never seen him in before. He looked older than he had in February, or perhaps I was simply seeing him more clearly. Gary Pullman was mid-40s, heavy-set, with the reflexive confidence of a man who was accustomed to winning through volume. We sat on opposite sides of the table. The mediator, a retired judge named Harmon, opened the session with a brief procedural overview. Then Martin outlined our position. It took 45 minutes. I watched Dennis's face while Martin spoke, the way I might watch weather coming across a flat plain, noting where the pressure was building. He was controlled. He was very controlled. He sat with his hands folded and his jaw set, and Gary Pullman occasionally wrote something on a legal pad, and Dennis would glance at it, and he stayed controlled. He stayed controlled through the presentation of Diane's forensic report. He stayed controlled through the timeline of the LLC filings. He stayed controlled, barely, when Elaine Okafor stood up and laid out the evidence that Frank had been skimming, not just from the government, but from Dennis himself, and that Dennis had known. Not for weeks, she explained. Not recently. The financial records suggested Dennis had been aware of the discrepancy in his share for at least 3 years and had chosen not to confront Frank directly, presumably because confronting Frank would have required explaining to authorities why he was monitoring the distribution of undeclared cash proceeds. That was when Dennis broke. He didn't shout. It wasn't theatrical. What happened was that his lawyer put a hand on his arm, and Dennis shook it off, and he leaned forward across the table and pointed at me. Actually pointed, his index finger extended, and said, "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know any of it. Frank was protecting you. You were too simple to handle the truth, and he knew it. And the fact that you're sitting here with your lawyers acting like you have any right to anything—" Mr. Henderson. Judge Harmon's voice was perfectly level. "You will lower your voice. She has no right to that money." Dennis started again. "Dennis." Gary Pullman was very firm now. "We need to stop. He built those businesses with me." "Stop talking," Pullman said. Dennis sat back. His face was flushed, a deep, angry red that started at his collar and rose. He breathed through his nose. He looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I held it, his eyes, his anger, all of it. Because I had made a decision somewhere in the last 5 months that I was done looking away from things that frightened me. Mrs. Henderson. Elaine Okafor's voice was quiet. Would you like to respond? I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, no, I think everything relevant has been said. The mediator called a 15-minute recess. Dennis and Pullman went into the hallway. I stayed at the table and Martin poured me a glass of water and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. When they came back in, Pullman requested a private session with the mediator. They were in the mediator's office for 22 minutes. When Harmon returned, he announced that Dennis Henderson's legal team was withdrawing their claim against the estate. That was it. No dramatic speech, no acknowledgement. Dennis stood and straightened his suit jacket and walked out of the conference room without looking at me, and Gail, who had been sitting in the observers' chairs along the wall, followed him with her mouth pressed into a thin line. Martin put his pen cap on carefully. Elaine gathered her documents with the methodical efficiency of someone for whom this moment was professional, not personal. For me, it was personal, very personal. I sat for a moment after they left, and I let the silence of the room settle around me, and I thought about Frank's note, "Forgive me if you can." And I thought about whether I could, and I thought that was a question I'd be answering for the rest of my life, and that was fine. I had the time now. I had, it turned out, quite a lot of time. The legal machinery moved with a speed that surprised me. Once the obstacle of Dennis's opposition was removed, Martin had been right about the IRS voluntary disclosure. The penalty and back tax calculation came to approximately $4.2 million, a number Martin had negotiated down significantly through Diane's documentation, my demonstrated cooperation, and the fact that I was positioned legally as a non-participating spouse, not a co-conspirator. $4.2 million was a staggering sum. It was also, Martin reminded me, far less than what I would have faced in forfeiture proceedings if I had tried to hide the money or made any of the quiet deals Dennis had proposed. What remained after the tax resolution and legal fees was a little over $11 million, formally cleared, properly taxed, legally documented, and transferred into a legitimate investment account. $11 million. Mine. Clean. I gave the IRS everything they asked for. Every document, every folder from Frank's filing cabinet, Diane's complete report. Martin said my cooperation was exemplary. What happened to Dennis Henderson was the natural and logical consequence of that investigation. I did not file a criminal complaint. I did not push for prosecution. When the IRS applied their findings to Dennis's financial records, they found 15 years of systematic tax fraud and structuring violations that had everything to do with his own documented history. Dennis was indicted in April on 7 federal counts. He pled guilty to 2. He was sentenced to 38 months in federal prison, supervised release, and a financial penalty. His attorneys spent the rest of that year negotiating down. I read the sentencing summary in Martin's office and said nothing. This was not revenge. This was consequence. There is a difference, and it matters. Martin shook my hand across his desk. Mrs. Henderson, you handled one of the most difficult situations I've encountered in 30 years of practice, with a composure and strategic clarity that most people with legal training, I'll add, would have struggled to match. I thanked him. I meant it. I drove home on a late April afternoon when the trees along the highway were finally beginning to bloom. that tentative green of early Ohio spring. I thought about Frank, about what it meant to love someone for 26 years and discover that love had been built on a floor with a trapdoor in it. I had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because carrying unforgiveness is heavy, and I was done carrying heavy things I didn't have to carry. I pulled into the cracked driveway on Elmwood Drive and made one phone call. "Ray," I said when he picked up, "this is Carol Henderson. I'm ready to get started on that driveway." The driveway was the beginning. It sounds small, but if you have spent 22 years being told that repairing your own driveway is beyond your means, there is something genuinely significant about the morning a crew shows up, does the work, and you write the check knowing it won't bounce. I did not move. The house was also where I had raised my children, and the garden was genuinely mine. What I did instead was transform it. New kitchen, new countertops, the bathroom finally tiled, the living room painted in a deep teal that Frank would never have allowed. The practical is overrated. I flew to Portland to see Melissa that August, the first time I'd visited her there. We walked on the coast and I told her everything. She held my hand and didn't try to reframe it. I was grateful for the honesty of that. Trevor came in September with his girlfriend Anita, and we sat on the back porch and talked about the future. I had structured the money carefully. A trust for the children, a foundation for women navigating estate disputes, and the rest invested quietly and well. Patty and I have lunch every Friday. We have not missed one. As for Dennis and Gail, Dennis reported to the Federal Correctional Facility in Morgantown in November. Gail filed for divorce within 60 days of the sentencing, moved back to Kentucky, and started over in her mid-50s without assets and without a husband. The house in Centerville sold at a significant loss. I found I had no particular feeling about any of it. Not satisfaction, not sympathy. Just an acknowledgement of how choices compound over time. Last spring, I planted roses along the back fence. They bloomed in June, full and pink, and I stood at my kitchen window and looked at them, and I thought, this is what I was protecting. This ordinary, beautiful mine life. Frank's note said he loved me every day, even when he was wrong. I believe him. I have made peace with both halves of that sentence. But I also know that I loved myself better than he did, and that, in the end, was what made all the difference. What would you have done if you had opened that suitcase? I would love to know. Leave it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, if even one part of it felt true, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening, every single one of you.